Let's open our Bibles and let's go to Psalm 143 today. Psalm 143. We're gradually closing in on the end of the book of Psalms. We've been at this about 3 years now, by my reckoning. Psalm 143, and we'll read the first 6 verses today. Hear my prayer, O Lord. Give ear to my supplications. In thy faithfulness answer me, and in thy righteousness. And enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified. For the enemy hath persecuted my soul. He hath smitten my life down to the ground. He hath made me to dwell in darkness as those that have been long dead. Therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. I muse on the work of thy hands. I stretch forth my hands unto thee. My soul thirsteth after thee, as a thirsty land. Selah. This psalm is written in the same refrain as the preceding one, Psalm 142. The righteousness and faithfulness mentioned here in verse 1 are not in the New Testament sense of Romans 10, for example, but the righteousness which is of faith, speaketh on this wise, Romans 10:6, or for with the heart man believeth unto righteousness, Romans 10:10. But it's in the Old Testament sense of texts like Job 8, verse 6, which says, If thou wert pure and upright, surely now he would awake for thee, and make the habitation of thy righteousness prosperous. Abraham tried to negotiate or to barter with God for Lot's sake. Genesis 18:25. That be far from thee to do after this manner, to slay the righteous with the wicked, and that the righteous should be as the wicked. That be far from thee. Shall not the judge of all the earth do right? He's trying to turn the argument to put back God into a corner. Amazing how gracious God was with Abraham. A man whose reputation was for doing more good than bad was called a righteous man in the Old Testament. And someone who was known for doing more bad than good was labeled an unjust or an unrighteous or a wicked man. I want you to go back and notice Deuteronomy chapter 6. Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6, verses 24 and 25. Notice the answer, the response the Jews gave back to Moses. Deuteronomy 6, verses 24 and 25. And the Lord commanded us to do all these statutes, to fear the Lord our God, for our good always, that he might preserve us alive, as it is at this day. And it shall be our righteousness, if we observe to do all these commandments before the Lord our God, as he hath commanded us. But also go forward to the book of Isaiah. Isaiah 64. Isaiah 64. And notice one verse there, verse 6. Isaiah 64:6. But we are all as an unclean thing, and all our righteousnesses are as filthy rags. And we all do fade as a leaf, and our iniquities, like the wind, have taken us away. The obedience to the law and the commandments measured a man's righteousness in the Old Testament before God. And it's in this sense that the word is used here in Psalm 143. When you read the Bible, you should bear in mind the difference between, as I mentioned, I think last Sunday in our preaching time, the righteousness which is earned by a man or woman because of their faithfulness to God's revelation, and the righteousness which is earned by Jesus Christ, which belongs to Jesus Christ, that can then be applied to your account. That's the kind of righteousness you need. yours is insufficient. It will never get you into the pearly gates. It won't get you into heaven. And but people mistakenly think salvation throughout the entire Bible has been the same in every age and every dispensation, every revelation of God, that salvation has been the same for everyone all the time. It certainly has not been. When a man was righteous in the Old Testament, it would get him as far as Abraham's bosom, the place of comfort, but it didn't get him to the third heaven, because he needed a perfect sacrifice that would do for him what all the animals before could not do. They were unable to do. It'd get him to Abraham's bosom if he died among the righteous. But what he needed was one perfect sacrifice that would make up, that would fill in the gap, fill in the blank between the value of his sacrifices and the kind of perfection that God required. That was the death of the Lord Jesus Christ. And so you'll hear these radio preachers very often say in the Old Testament they were saved by looking forward to the cross. And they don't offer any explanation as to what they mean by that. And in the New Testament, people are saved by looking back at the cross. And they make Calvary and the death of Christ the central event. That's the greatest event that ever took place in the Bible, or that ever took place thus far in history. But that doesn't mean that people in the Old Testament were saved in anticipation of the coming of Jesus Christ. Let's suppose, and there's very little reason to think that, reading the Old Testament, to think that anybody in the Old Testament under the laws of Moses knew anything about the coming of the Son of God and his death at Calvary. So they couldn't be living in hopeful expectation and anticipation of it. Even if they were, it wouldn't do them any good until his death had taken place. So their righteousness, as established by their obedience to God, got them as far as Abraham's bosom. But once Jesus Christ died, descended, and preached to those spirits in prison, that the Bible calls it, I'm the one that you've been waiting for. I'm the one all those animals before were typified and pictured in type, even if you didn't know it, even if you weren't aware of it. But all those times you brought an animal, they typified, they pictured me. And my sacrifice is now perfect. And he filled in, he made up for what their animal sacrifice could not achieve. So in a sense, nobody goes to heaven, or nobody ever went to heaven, by looking forward to the cross of Christ. So it might have been 30 minutes after the death of Christ, or only 5 minutes after the death of Christ. Everybody in Abraham's bosom was saved by looking back at Christ's death on Calvary. Like I say, it might have only been a minute or 5 minutes, but it was still after the fact. And that's how a man gets to the third heaven, by trusting in the death of Jesus Christ alone. But David wants, in our psalm here, David wants God to answer him. Number one, because God is faithful to his saints. Number two, David is sure of his own righteousness at that time. And so God would be doing right in helping him in his time of need. Verse 2, and enter not into judgment with thy servant, for in thy sight shall no man living be justified. No man would be justified in God's sight if God entered into judgment with him. God will always be more righteous than you or I are. He'll always be free and clear of any unjust treatment that you might think he's subjected you to. For in thy sight shall no man living be justified. Abraham was justified by works, but only when he offered up his son Isaac. Was not Abraham our father justified by works when he had offered Isaac his son upon the altar? James 2:21 asks. Hebrews 11 verse 17 refers to Isaac as Abraham's only begotten son, completely rejecting Ishmael. He was a type of the Lord Jesus Christ. To justify yourself means you give a good reason, you give a good excuse for something you did in order to be spared from something else, such as judgment. But when you're justified by God, it means that He has cleared you of any guilt. He's vindicated you. He's exonerated you. And on that basis, you are exempt from divine judgment. I'm glad that I was justified by putting my hope and trust in the work of the Lord Jesus Christ, and not depending upon my own effort or my own goodness, of which there's very, very little, and trust Him alone. And as I mentioned in our church time, the simplicity of the gospel is to call. To call. When I was 6 years old and I went forward under my father's preaching, as I've said to you many times before, this is the most vivid memory of my early childhood. I don't have many clear memories of my life before that day. Maybe if I tried hard, I might be able to think of a few things. But I don't have very many memories before that time. That's the most vivid memory of my early years. 6 years old, I went forward at the end of a church and his sermon, and I knew I was guilty of sin. And I was praying and had my head down on the prayer rail there, and I remember simply crying, "Forgive me, forgive me." That's all I knew how to say. And but I knew something was happening, and I wouldn't have been able to explain it to you when I was 6 years old. And I'm sure later on, my dad double-checked with me to see if I understood what it was that I had done. But to be truthful, I don't remember that conversation. I know that we did. I know we went in the little office that he had at that time to just be sure that I knew what I had just done. But to be frank, I don't remember that conversation. All I remember was what was taking place when I called out to God as a 6-year-old boy. And I know that God saved me, and He washed me clean from whatever sin I was guilty of and understood, cleansed my soul and regenerated my little dead spirit, wrote my name in the Lamb's Book of Life, came to dwell within me, and has been with me ever since that day. Amen. It's good to be saved. Amen. But a man can't enter into judgment with God because he has nothing to barter with or to bargain with. He has nothing to offer God that doesn't already belong to God to begin with. You live a holy life. His life was divinely holy, completely pure. You say you live a pretty good life. He lived a perfect life. He's always going to outdo you in any virtue or any quality you think you possess. And you have nothing to bring to Him that He doesn't already possess, that He doesn't already have. Look at verse 3. For the enemy hath persecuted my soul. He hath smitten my life down to the ground. He hath made me to dwell in darkness as those that have been long dead. This verse is literally messianic hope, awaiting the glorious return of the King because of persecution under the man of sin, under the Antichrist. You can see the application to someone in the tribulation. And there's a similar text like it. Go back to Psalm 88. Psalm 88. And let's begin there at about verse 6. Very similar language. Thou hast laid me in the lowest pit, in darkness, in the deeps. Thy wrath lieth hard upon me, and thou hast afflicted me with all thy waves. Selah. Thou hast put away mine acquaintance far from me. Thou hast made me an abomination unto them. I am shut up, and I cannot come forth. Mine eye mourneth by reason of affliction, Lord. Lord, I have called daily upon thee. I have stretched out my hands unto thee. Wilt thou show wonders to the dead? Shall the dead arise and praise thee? Selah. Shall thy loving kindness be declared in the grave, or thy faithfulness in destruction? Shall thy wonders be known in the dark, and thy righteousness in the land of forgetfulness? But unto thee have I cried, O Lord, and in the morning shall my prayer prevent thee. Prevent, as you might recall, is a compound or a contracted word, means to pre-event, to go before. And the psalmist is saying, the first thing I'm going to do is start my day praying and talking to God. That'll be the very first thing I do before God even knows what hit him. I'm going to be on my knees talking to him. But verses 4 and 5, back in our text, therefore is my spirit overwhelmed within me. My heart within me is desolate. I remember the days of old. I meditate on all thy works. I muse on the work of thy hands. These two verses could apply to any saint who is in a deep distress or depression. Look back at Psalm 142 and verses 2 through 4. I poured out my complaint before him. I showed before him my trouble. When my spirit was overwhelmed within me, then thou knewest my path. In the way wherein I walked have they privily laid a snare for me. I looked on my right hand, and beheld, but there was no man that would know me. Refuge failed me. No man cared for my soul. The days of old, mentioned there in verse 5, are the former days of Israel's dependence on God, as reviewed by the Psalms. Look back at Psalm 78. Psalm 78, and the first 4 verses there for right now. Psalm 78, beginning at verse 1. Give ear, O my people, to my law. Incline your ears to the words of my mouth. I will open my mouth in a parable. I will utter dark sayings of old, which we have heard and known, and our fathers have told us. We will not hide them from their children, showing to the generation to come the praises of the Lord and his strength and his wonderful works that he hath done. And then what follows, of course, is an entire Psalm 72 verses, recalling God's provision, God's leading, God's blessing, God's protection of the nation of Israel in their history. And likewise, Psalm 136. Psalm 136. And begin there at verse 7. To him that made great lights, for his mercy endureth forever. The sun to rule by day, for his mercy endureth forever. The moon and stars to rule by night, for his mercy endureth forever. To him that smote Egypt in their firstborn, for his mercy endureth forever, and brought out Israel from among them, for his mercy endureth forever, and so forth and so on. It's the retelling of God's protection, God's blessing to the nation of Israel over many centuries, and over many different trials and times of testing. Verse 5 in our text says, I remember, I meditate, and I muse on the work of thy hands. To muse, that's a good word. It means to think about, to ponder, to dwell upon in the mind. And if you add an A as a prefix, the word amuse means to not think. Ken Hovind made a great observation that we have whole venues called amusement parks, where you go there and not think for several hours. That's about what it amounts to. Go down to Disney. Okay, one ticket for one day, that'll be $150, sir. Oh, okay. You reach for... You want to park your car in our parking lot? That's another $25. Okay. Where else are you going to park? You know what? I have no $6, $7 for a bottle of water. We used to drink out of the hose, the garden hose. The water out of your tap is completely drinkable. Every city has very strict sanitary regulations they have to comply with, and it's completely drinkable. If you want to run it through a filter or something, we do at home, and then I think it does improve the taste, but it's completely drinkable. Hey, the water out of the toilet is the same water that's coming out of your tap. So you can't say, well, my dog, that's disgusting. It's the same water. And I have absolutely no reason to visit Disney or Disneyland again, just for the insult factor. $25 to park your car in their parking lot. I guess what bothers me is whatever Disney wants, Disney gets. And they moved all the homeless away from Disneyland. As well, they were all congregating under the 57 freeway by the Santa Ana River there, and everyone's heard about it. There's videos you can find on the internet. I watched a couple of those bike riders going down a bike trail with a helmet camera. There must have been 1,000 people under there. And they cleared out about 400 yards just earlier this week. The first day they reported in that 400 yards of debris, something like 11,000 pounds of human waste and 5,000 hypodermic needles. I forget how many hundreds of tons of just trash and garbage and refuse. So I think they've cleaned out the entire thing before the week was over. Hundreds of people now put in local hotel or motel rooms. And other people, they just decide to move on and go somewhere else. But Disney got Anaheim to get rid of the bus benches in and around Disneyland, because the bus benches are places where homeless people sleep at night in just about every city that's got a homeless population. And we don't want tourists and visitors from other countries to see that when they come to Disneyland. So they were clever in getting the city of Anaheim to brush them off to the outskirts, the edges of town, under the freeway. Now, there's a silver lining to that, because if I ever end up homeless, there's a sweet spot waiting for me right under that Santa Ana bridge, right under the Anaheim Stadium Big A. There's plenty of room now. All the other people are gone. Don't tell anybody, though. I don't want any neighbors. I want some elbow room. But verse 6. I stretch forth my hands unto thee, my soul thirsteth after thee, as a thirsty land. Selah. The word Selah shows up once more in verse 6, indicating some connection to the Jews in the tribulation, the glorious second advent of Christ, just around the corner. And the persecuted saint is thirsty, both spiritually and literally. At least he will be then. The Jews will be driven into the wilderness, fleeing from the man of sin, the son of perdition, and they'll need the mercy and the kindness and the watchfulness and the protection of God to look out for them. People fleeing, and the Lord Jesus said, let him not go back into his house and collect his stuff, but flee to the mountains and in the wilderness, and so forth. Woe to them that are with child, and them that give suck in those days. You know, it's a very difficult and intensive move to travel anywhere with young children or little babies nursing. And no time to get the diaper bag, no time to make sure you got formula, no time to make sure you got extra diapers, and so forth. You have to go through this whole checklist in your mind before you can go anywhere with your baby. And all you moms, you've known that and experienced that. But that's why your husband's out in the car honking hard, wondering why you're taking so long. You're getting ready for at least two. And you have to keep all those things in mind. But they'll be fleeing from the man of sin, and they'll need the mercy of God to sustain them and to keep them alive. Under Moses, a long time ago, we read, he clave the rocks in the wilderness and gave them drink as out of great depths. He brought streams also out of the rock and cause waters to run down like rivers. Psalm 78, verses 15 and 16. And it'll happen again in the near future.